Welcome to UpYourStack podcast. I'm your host, Noah Berk. I'm also the co-founder of OBO, an elite HubSpot solutions partner. Every week we feature interviews with some of our favorite HubSpot app partners who've either built their apps on HubSpot or have integrated with HubSpot to help you get the most out of your HubSpot tech stack. And today I have an awesome guest, Sam, who's a VP of Partnerships and Strategic Alliances at DealHub. Sam, welcome to the show.
Hey Noah, thanks for having me. I'm excited to be here and thrilled to be speaking with you again.
It's fantastic to have you here as well. And Sam, I just want to dive right in. I'm sure a lot of people in the audience are familiar perhaps with CPQ, which we'll get into a little bit more as we go further, but maybe you can enlighten the audience with what is DealHub?
Absolutely. So DealHub is a next-gen CPQ. So configure, price, quote, but also CLM, contract management lifecycle, subscription management, a billing platform, and all of that with the ability to generate content in traditional Word or PDF format, as well as in a more engagement web environment that we call Deal Room.
Gotcha. So why is this important and who is this important for?
So when we approached how to build a platform in the solution, we essentially looked at all of the relevant personas that are part of the quoting process. And so that is the sales rep, but that's also what we call the backend. So sales op, rev ops, as well as the end customer. So buyer engagement as well. And so when we build that platform, we build a solution that makes every step in the process easier, scalable, and more appealing to all of those people that are part of the quoting process.
So when we think about CPQ, and I think it's something that we'd like to educate the audience on, is what's the importance of CPQ? And why do people need to purchase a separate piece of software for it? You would think it comes in a lot of the applications out of the box, but I personally know it's much more complicated, but I'd love to hear from you.
Absolutely. Essentially, what we built is we looked at what are the issues and the pains within the quoting process. And yes, you have out-of-the-box standard quoting tools, but you have the same issues that come up with those tools. And we looked at what are the pains of businesses when they look at their quote to revenue process or at the quoting process. So whether it's the complexity of the business as a company scales, for example. Also, as companies grow, there's usually a lack of alignment and standardization. And you can also see that companies are more and more focused on everything that has to do with automated and data-driven processes and decision-making. And so when we looked at those pains, it really resonated with customer. They needed a solution that grows with them, that can easily adapt to their constantly changing business needs, and not having to re-implement tools. So needing to add features or to develop additional features or to develop additional integrations just because those standard tools weren't built to really handle that complexity and that scale. And so agility is the basis of today's business environment. And the solutions that you use, they need to keep pace with that.
And can you give some examples of how companies are using CPQ? Maybe like some examples, is it around recurring revenue where you sign a contract? Is it an example of maybe there's multiple different, you buy one product, but then there's 20 other SKUs
Exactly.
that need to be associated with that product?
Exactly. So if you look at standard quoting, if you just need to have a pick list of products and you just put a discount on something, you don't really need a CPQ. But the moment you have to configure a solution, for example, if you have prerequisites or dependencies or bundles, limitations, that's where you need a CPQ. I'll give you an example I like to use is, imagine I'm selling hardware and I'm a company that sells hardware and I sell bundles and I sell very large projects with hundreds of SKUs that are or line items in every quote that I put out there. If one of my reps forgot a line item of a cable, for example, because he forgot to put it in because it wasn't bundled or because he just didn't pick it, and that cable costs $20,000, and he sends out that quote to the customer, signs it, great. You get to actually deliver the project, and now there's a $20,000 cable missing. Who's going to pay for it? Are you going to come back to the customer and say, hey, Mr. Customer, sorry, I forgot that $20,000 cable. I'll need to add that to your invoice. Or do you take the hit and say, you know what, we signed, and that's essentially it. So the more complexity, the more use cases you have, I would say, the more you need a CPQ, if that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. I also tend to think of this as a force multiplier because the example that you gave of an individual rep who has to think through what are all the individual SKUs associated with the primary SKU, one, that would just take a ton of time. So do you want the rep selling or do you want the rep quoting and building out quotes? And I think the CPQ can absolutely help out with a solution like that, especially as it gets more complicated with what you're actually selling a customer. So what I'm hearing is not only does this potentially save a rep a lot of time by having essentially pre-configured quotes based upon whatever that primary object or the primary product you're selling, but it also reduces errors that could be extremely costly for both the company and potentially the client if they didn't get what they thought they were going to be getting in the first place.
Yeah,
And
it's exactly that.
yeah,
Sorry, go ahead, no.
yeah, and I guess when thinking about it, you think of a CRM, you're like, how come CRMs don't have all this pre-built into it? There are some out there that do, but there's a degree of complexity I think that most people just are unaware of when it comes to a CPQ solution. But how difficult is it to get like something like a business like DealHub going, building this all out? Like the logic just must seem intense.
So it is. The engine that we build within the CPQ is really key here. And the way I'll talk a little bit maybe about why the DealHub was created in the first place is that, and it ties to what you were mentioning, is that our leadership team have a background in working in quote to revenue, and they have expertise in building complex pricing and complex product catalogs as well. And coming from that background, they had implemented many tools in the past, and they realized that there were still a lot of issues with them in terms of implementing them, maintaining them, and also from the user's perspective, like change management of side of things, it was just really complex and slow. And so rather than using the same old method, I would say, of how other tools were doing it, they decided to kind of design DealHub with a different philosophy in mind from traditional CPQs. And it was, again, designed to address all of the users involved and making sure that once you have the right engine in place, everything you can add on to that and how it then rolls on into additional features and additional areas of the business makes it a lot easier. And so having that core engine was really key to building the CPQ around it. And that's, I would say, the main difference between what I say a CPQ and what a lot of tools are, I call PQs. They do pricing and quoting, but they're not a configured solution.
Correct. So when a company purchases from, let's say, DealHub, how much pre-work is there to think through your process? Like what should a company, before they reach out to you, or maybe they reached out to you, but before configuration, what should they be thinking about to make sure the deployment goes successfully?
That's an excellent question. So the advantage of DealHub is that it's a no-code solution. So it's a configured solution. And as soon as you start looking at configuring things, what you need to have in place is, what does your process looks like? So for example, do you have your product catalog? Is that cleaned up? So you might say, we're talking about SKUs, you ask companies, they'll say, oh, I have 5,000 SKUs. Great. How many of those are actually active? Oh, they'll tell you about 40% of them. Like the other 60% are old SKUs that they never got rid of. So having your product catalog, having your pricing as well, having your pricing done, and that's something that always comes up again, where if you ask most companies, a lot of them will say, we're looking at changing our pricing again and changing our pricing in 6 months or in 3 months. And that's where also the configuring part is really valuable of DealHub, is that it adapts constantly. So you change your pricing, great. You can change it easily on the back end because it's a configured no-code solution. If it's hard-coded, you're talking about any change you want to make is completely different. So I would say, your product catalog, your pricing, and then anything that has to do with the flows that you want to run from there. So for example, do you have a discount policy? Great. What discount policy do you want to have, whether it's globally, regionally, and do you want to standardize that? Looking at approval workflows. So DealHub, we support parallel approval workflows, both commercial, technical, and legal as well. So do you have your approval workflow set? What are the stages within that approval workflow? So I would say looking at your processes and saying, okay, these are my processes and this is what I now want to implement. And you use the technology to implement those processes and automate those processes. So that, I would say, would be where I would recommend companies look at and make sure that they're ready for when implementing a CPQ. I will add a small caveat to that, which is sometimes, or in in quite a few good cases, implementing CPQ actually helps you and forces the business to do that. So they might not have an official discount policy or tiered volume policy or whatever it might be. But the fact that they're now going to implement the CPQ is their chance to now say, okay, we're going to implement this technology. Let's look at our policies. Let's look at our flows. Let's look at, okay, we don't have a flow for this. Let's build one out. That's the opportunity as we're implementing the CPQ. So implementing the platform also helps you, pushes the businesses to build out what they need to build out.
But it's fascinating. I love reading, and I'm on a kick right now, it seems like, with restaurant books. I just finished reading Everything in Its Place, Mise en Place. And I think to myself, what the CPQ tool does, essentially puts everything in its place that needs to go there. So rather than you having to think, am I enforcing this rule, or one rep is doing it this way, or one rep's doing it this way, by working through this motion, you're essentially cleaning your workspace, you're making it more efficient. You can easily be able to build quotes without necessarily having to think long and hard about that particular quote. And then we get into what we talked about earlier, the time savings and the reduction of errors and the speed to quote. All these things start playing together that enable a rep to just simply be way more efficient in the end when they have these tools properly set up for them. And really, it's in most cases, I think of a CPQ as a must-have. You can get through brute force with a PQ if you want, but for most organizations, that simply won't cut it in the long run. So there's other players in this space. And how do you suppose DealHub really differentiates itself from the competitors?
I would look at maybe 3 areas where we see ourselves as different from our competitors. Is one, it's a configured environment, not just pricing and quoting, like I mentioned the P and the Q, but it's a configured environment. And because it's no code and it's a configured environment, you don't need to rely on IT or technical resources to maintain and manage this. So you're a lot more agile. You want to make a change, you can make that change within minutes. You can make that change within a day and a big change, and you're up and running and you made that change and as it adapts to you. So I would say instead of having to sometimes adapt your internal processes as a business to the technology you're using, the technology actually adapts to the way you work and how fast you want to work and how quick you want to be up and running and how quick you want to make changes to really support how you're evolving as a business. The second area is playbook, which is essentially what we call playbook, which is guided selling. It's the ability to walk the salesperson through the process of building a quote. It's intuitive, it's easy to use, and the adoption rate is great, and the onboarding is really fast because it makes it a no-brainer. So the reps just go through that guided selling, which is built like a decision tree, and it makes every step of creating that quote very easy and simple. And the last area where I would look at where we believe that we're different is that we have multiple capabilities into one solution. So we have document generation or dynamic document generation with CPQ. We have deal room for customer engagement. And it also takes into account information input. So you can actually capture information from the quote and feed that back into the CRM. And that helps with contract management. So whether it's service start dates, whether it's the discount level, whether it's the exact pricing of different items and what margins you gave on each of these line items, all of that is fed back into the CRM. So you capture all that information that's being generated during the process of creating a quote and sending that quote out to customers.
That's awesome. I do want to switch subjects slightly here. How are you filling in the gaps in the HubSpot ecosystem? Like, how does DealHub play a part here? Maybe you can elaborate a little bit more for us.
Absolutely. So it goes back to what I talked about earlier about what is a real CPQ and when is a CPQ needed. And HubSpot has out-of-box quoting, but it wasn't designed to be a CPQ, and that's absolutely fine. It just wasn't designed to be that way. And so again, if you just need to pick a few products and just slap a discount on it, then great. HubSpot quoting will work great, and you don't need a CPQ. But as soon as you go into the world of configuring a solution with prerequisites, with dependencies, with bundles, that's where you need a CPQ to be able to support what you're trying to do. We're essentially filling the gap by delivering a complete solution for selecting the right product, building the right quote, and syncing this all back into HubSpot CRM.
That's awesome. And so really the individuals who we're talking about who'd be most interested, obviously in the B2B space. Correct me if I'm wrong, I don't necessarily think business to consumers are really using CPQ tools, although I'm sure there's some particular use cases. Who are the majority of your clients? Like what industries do they tend to fall into?
Absolutely. So most of our customers would fall, I would say, into three buckets. We have customers that do from all industries and they do a lot of things. But if I look at the majority of our customers that utilize DealHub today, I would say SaaS companies and hardware companies. I would say within manufacturing, assembly, those are companies or that's an industry that leverages our solution, and business services.
Sure. Okay, awesome. I think that's just really useful for anyone listening today to say, okay, would I need a particular tool like this? Is there generally a particular size team that once they get to a certain size at a minimum level, they start thinking CPQ? Because in the beginning, you're one or two people, like, sure, I can go talk to my manager and be like, hey, listen, does this quote look right? Yeah, it looks right. Go ahead and send it. At what point does a company like, all right, I got to get a CPQ here?
Yeah, you're right. So I would say mid-market, enterprise, that's where we play. That's where the solution really delivers significant impact on the business as well. You mentioned one or two people. Great. I think a CPQ isn't needed at that stage. I would say when you're looking at 15 reps, 15, 20 reps, that's where DealHub really can deliver great value, starting from kind of those sizes of sales teams.
That's good to know. And that's just as important for the audience if you're thinking to yourself, am I at the right size for CPQ? And I would probably go one step further is one, how much would an error cost you in a quote? And how much time is it you're taking your team to put together these quotes? And then also, how complicated is it scoping this out? How many dependencies are associated with it? And to make sure that once you start thinking about all those variables, then you start making a decision, is it worth the investment in a CPQ? Everyone's paying their people a lot of money these days, and there's a lot easier ways to get work done than having them sit there and play around with spreadsheets until they get the quote right. Don't get me wrong, that's still part of the process, I'm sure, no matter what. If you have a CPQ, you're probably playing around with numbers anyway, but at least translating that into an actual quote for the client can be way easier. What's in the future roadmap, and how does AI fit into this?
I would look at, there's a lot of additional functionalities that's coming around CPQ, but I would say, in my opinion, one of the most interesting ones is around the enhancement of our contract management capabilities. So we'll be introducing a contract repository very shortly. It's essentially the ability to store your contracts in one place. But on top of that, we will look at adding AI to it. So have AI to essentially be able to help you out by searching for specific contracts with specific characteristics. As an example, I want to see the contracts where I'm at high risk. So you'd be able to search and say, okay, show me the contracts that have X amount and above of liability, or show me the contracts with payment terms over X. And so if you consider those contracts at risk, you'd be able essentially to ask that question and have AI find you and show you all of the contracts that match what you're looking for. And to have it search and learn based on all of your contracts and the deals that you're closing, being able to learn from that and always show you what's most relevant to what you're asking.
AI is playing, and I think anyone who's listened to some of these shows in the past at this point, everyone is embedding AI into their tools. And AI is one of those mechanisms that, just like these individual tools are providing a specialized function, AI within these tools are going to provide specialized functions. It's all just about improving not just the speed of the way we get things done, but also making it better along the way. I'm pretty excited for some of the stuff you guys have coming out. And then just in terms of the HubSpot ecosystem itself, and as DealHub has really built a very strong relationship with HubSpot reps and the ecosystem and partners, what suggestion or advice do you have for anyone else who may be considering, how do I build an app that integrates extremely well with HubSpot? Like, how do I get this traction?
For me, it's a very simple phrase, which I use in everything, is find a pain and fix it. And so find the gap in HubSpot's product offering and build an app that either closes that gap or complements or enhances existing capabilities that kind of helps fix that pain.
That's awesome. And I think that's, again, to the listeners who've listened to previous episodes, I think that's a pretty common theme, is find the gap, fix the gap, close the gap. We're all talking about a gap here in the ecosystem. Sam, this was awesome having you on the show today. Thank you so much. Just a wealth of information. I know as an intro for a lot of people into what CPQ is, how it works. Of course, what is DealHub and how is DealHub filling this gap in the ecosystem? But it was awesome having you here. And to all of our listeners, thanks for joining us today. That wraps it up. Up Your Stack is a weekly podcast featuring some of our favorite HubSpot app partners who either built their apps on HubSpot or integrated with HubSpot. And it's sponsored by the OBO group, of which I'm a co-founder. If you're interested to learn more about Sam, I'm assuming, Sam, they can find you on LinkedIn. If you want to share your last name, and I'll let you share that along with where else they can find out more information about DealHub.
Absolutely. So first of all, Noah, thanks for having me. It was great. Always a pleasure chatting with you. Yeah, you can find me on LinkedIn. So Sam Bratsztejn. If you search DealHub and then Alliances Partnership, I should pop up, and feel free to reach out. Happy to answer any questions, potential customers might have, or any thoughts or any comments. Always welcome.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Sam. And if you're interested in leveling up your own HubSpot, feel free to reach out to the OBO group. You can check us out at www.theobogroup.com. Thanks for joining us.